welcome. You are listening to the Theology Mill from Whitfenstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I work here at Whitfenstock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, come stop by our website at whitfenstock.com. That's W-I-P-F and stock, S-T-O-C-K.com. This episode is part of our Apocalyptic Paul Booth, in which we'll interview 3 leading scholars working on apocalyptic readings of Paul. So in this first interview, I talk with Dr. Jamie Davies. Dr. Davies is the tutor of New Testament and director of research at Trinity College, Bristol. And his research largely concerns apocalyptic thought in the New Testament and other Second Temple Jewish and Christian literature, especially focusing on the letters and theology of St. Paul. Among his books are his recent The Apocalyptic Paul, Retrospect and Prospect, with us at Cascade, which published in 2022. In subsequent episodes of the Apocalyptic Paul Booth series, we will also get the chance to talk with Drs. Douglas Herink and Susan Grove Eastman. So stay tuned for those interviews. And if you'd like to buy a copy of Dr. Davies' book, The Apocalyptic Paul, you can get it for 40% off with the code DAVIES23. That's D-A-V-I-E-S 23, and that's in all caps. And that will be good through June 6th, 2023. With that, thank you so much for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. So I am here with Dr. Jamie Davies, author of fairly recent, still somewhat newish book, The Apocalyptic Paul, Retrospect and Prospect, which has caused some waves, and everybody I've talked to about it so far has praised it highly. So yeah, you should be happy to, including the likes of Susan Eastman and Douglas Herink. They both, without me even questioning them about the book specifically, they both brought it up and spoke really highly of it. So, and then we are sharing a drink over a video call. I've had the same drink, I think, for a few episodes in a row. I've just got an Ethiopian coffee that I French pressed. I'm running on 5 hours of sleep right now, so this is my second cup of coffee of the day, and it's hopefully gonna perk me up a little bit. But so that's what I'm sipping on. How about you, Jamie?
Well, this is the challenge of time zones because I'm at the other end of the day. I'm just winding up at the end of a day's work, so I've had too much coffee already today, and it's not late enough for anything else yet. So I've got a cup of tea. You can always have a cup of tea. Doesn't matter what time of day it is.
Yes.
So I'm very boring. I've just got a straightforward mug of tea.
Oh man, I don't think that's boring. I love afternoon and evening tea. Okay, so let's talk about the Apocalyptic Paul. So yeah. One question I've asked, like I said, I interviewed Herink and Eastman, and one question I asked both of them is how they would describe Pauline apocalyptic kind of in a nutshell. So how would you explain it if you were sort of teaching a first year seminar to folks who had, not really read in the field?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a big part of the reason for the book and how it began really was it's the challenge of definition is right at the heart of the conversation about the apocalyptic Paul. There's some people who are kind of fed up with trying to talk about what the word means because there seems to be so many different definitions of it. People are prepared to throw up their hands and say we're not going to use it anymore. I'm not quite at that stage. I still think there's some hope for defining the word well, and that's what the first part of the book is really getting into is this challenge of definition. I mean, lexically, it just means revelatory, right? It's speaking about apocalypsis, revelation, unveiling, or disclosure, or something like that. So at the heart of it, you've got this kind of idea of some kind of epistemological claim about revelation. It's not quite as straightforward as that, of course, and it's complicated. One of the complications is whether it involves some kind of a connection to the apocalypses, the actual kind of literary deposit that we have of Jewish and Christian texts. Different scholars kind of think of that in different ways. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that for the most part, there is a recognition of that connection, variously understood, between Paul and the Jewish and Christian texts that we call apocalypses, even though he himself doesn't write an apocalypse, although 2 Corinthians 12 comes pretty close. But he writes in an apocalyptic mode, is one of the things I like to say. I like to use the word apocalyptic as an adjective rather than a noun.
Sure.
So then you have to say the apocalyptic what.
Sure.
But the thing that makes it really interesting to me, at least as a conversation, is that it's also there's quite a long theological heritage that's kind of brought in as well, under the label apocalyptic, particularly in the work of Karl Barth, but elsewhere as well. And that makes it really interesting because you've got this kind of three-cornered conversation that at least should be possible. We haven't managed to do it very well yet, I don't think, but between Paul scholars, Second Temple Judaism scholars, and systematic theologians. And that's one of the things that the book tries to do, is kind of host that conversation a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then what are some of the other ways of reading Paul that have sort of significant purchase in the theological academy? Like, and also how do they differ from the apocalyptic Paul? Like, what's sort of distinctive about apocalyptic readings of Paul?
Yeah, I mean, we could fill a whole podcast talking about the different schools of thought on Paul, right? There are so many different silos and schools and groups and perspectives on Paul. There seems to be a new one every 6 weeks. I mean, debates between the so-called new perspective and old perspective continue. That's still a lively discussion. More recently, there's growing weight in what was called the radical new perspective, sometimes called the Paul within Judaism school or perspective, which has got some very important insights to share about reading Paul within his Jewish world in various ways. And again, this is one of the problems with thinking of schools, is there's some problems that come along when we talk about particular schools of thought. One is it can be fairly complicit with tribalism, and the Guild of Paul scholars has already got schools within schools. We're good at defending the tribes, and that can be a problem. The other is it tends to assume homogeneity where it isn't there. So people, this has been a problem for years, but people would say, "Oh, you're of that school, you must believe X and Y," and it kind of masks the actual interesting differences that you'll find. So not all apocalyptic readers of Paul read him the same way. It's not simply kind of a repetition of talking points any more than that's the case with the Paul within Judaism people. There's lots of different things that means for different people. So I'm a little nervous of schools and labels. They can, as a shorthand, they can be helpful sometimes, but we've got to be really careful about kind of this complicity with siloing and becoming a tribe. And then you've got to defend your tribe against the other tribes, and that's just not conducive to good conversation. So
no.
In terms of what's distinctive about the apocalyptic reading of Paul, there's lots of things, but one of the things that I think is particularly sets it apart in some respects is it's very thoroughly a theological reading of Paul. It's definitely, that's one of the things that kind of marks it out. It's really a place where systematic theologians and Pauline scholars are in extended dialogue, and it's fairly unapologetic about being a particularly located theological reception of Paul. And as someone who's a Christian and teaching in a Christian school, that's part of my journey with Paul as well. And I find that to be a lot of fun, and that's certainly one of the things that marks it out. There are other things. I think it's quite broad in its scope. It's got a lot of ambition in the things that it's trying to say about Paul's thought. But that's a couple other things.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So then you brought up old and new perspective. So for those who don't know about the whole diversity of thought in sort of the Pauline Guild, how would you describe the old and new perspectives?
Wow.
I know, big question.
Yeah, well, there's a long conversation there. I mean, a lot of it is springing from the work of E.P. Sanders and his assessment of first century Judaism and his reassessment, as he saw it, of the the contours of Judaism in the first century, particularly on questions of the law. And the new perspective is often contrasted with certain supposedly Lutheran readings of Paul, particularly on the question of law and law observance, springing from Sanders' work. Sanders' basic argument was that Jews were not legalists. They weren't trying to earn their way into the covenant. They were that the observance of the law was a demonstration of and a maintenance of covenant belonging. It was what he called covenantal nomism. And so that was one of the things that that led to the springing up of the work of Tom Wright and Jimmy Dunn and others, which became known as the New Perspective. But it was already different from the very beginning. There was no singular new perspective, and you'll see differences between different scholars and so on. But the danger of calling something new, right? I mean, it's not new anymore. That was the late 70s and early 80s. So don't know whether it should still be called new, but there we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have your book as a good place to start, of course. And like I said, Doug Herink and Susan Eastman, both, when I asked them this question, the very first thing they said was your book, The Apocalyptic Paul. So as far as starting points, right, I would highly recommend, they would highly recommend your book. But where else might be some good starting places for those who are new to Pauline Apocalyptic?
I mean, that's lovely to hear, and it's very kind of those guys. The reason for writing the book was because I ended up writing my PhD on the Apocalyptic Paul, although I didn't set out to do that, and I kind of found my way into it by accident. And there wasn't really a one-stop intro to the discussion. Unlike, for example, with the New Perspective on Paul, where there were one or two really good introductory volumes, there wasn't an introduction to the Apocalyptic Paul, not really. So I had to kind of find out the contours of the conversation by reading a huge reading list. And I was reflecting on that, thinking, wouldn't it be nice for my students, now that I supervise people doing their PhDs, what could I give them to say this is the debate or this is the nature of the conversation? And I thought, well, if it doesn't exist, I should probably write it. So I sat down to write what I thought was going to be a quick intro. And it ended up morphing and growing and becoming something a little bit more substantial. But the first half of the book is intended to be that introduction. It's not the only one. There are some good essay collections out there. Beverly Gaventa edited a collection of essays, also called Apocalyptic Paul, although that's largely focused on a smaller kind of textual corpus. Ben Blackwell and Goodrich and Maston, Goodrich and Maston's Paul and the Apocalyptic Imagination is a really good essay collection springing out of an SBL session on Apocalyptic and Paul in San Diego, I think, a few years ago. I remember being very hot in an overcrowded room, listening to a bunch of people and trying to understand what was the same and what was different between the way these different people are thinking about apocalyptic. So there's a couple. There's a whole bunch of others, but basically the point of my book, one of the points of my book is to kind of be a signpost to show people here are the different voices, and to kind of show where they're the same and where they're different. Rather than, I'm not trying to be the arbiter of what the Apocalyptic Paul is. Right. Look at the book, I'm just kind of say this is the nature of the conversation at the minute as I understand it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I liked sort of the story you opened the book with about trying to familiarize yourself with this field as a grad student and how challenging that was. So could you tell us a little bit about sort of your discovery of the Apocalyptic Paul? I know Grant McCaskill played a role in that as well. So
he definitely did. It's all his fault, which is why I dedicate the book to him. He got me into this mess. I mean, I didn't want to be a Paul scholar. I tried to stay away from Paul, and I wanted to write my dissertation on Revelation, on the book of Revelation. Starting out doing that, Grant, my supervisor, sent me to read up a bit on what apocalyptic means. And he's got a very dry sense of humor, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing in sending me off to do this work, knowing that I was walking into an absolute maelstrom. So it kind of made sense as I was looking at the Jewish apocalypses and looking at work on Revelation and so on. There seemed to be something fairly coherent going on. And then when I started reading some of the stuff on Paul as an apocalyptic thinker, I started seeing, hang on a second, this seems to be similar in some respects and very different in others. And I came back confused, and a dissertation was born out of that confusion.
Yeah.
So maybe that's some encouragement to people who are still trying to find a topic. Sometimes the best topics come from when we really don't understand something, rather than having really grasped an idea. So yeah, I ended up working on Paul. I had a part-time job as a research assistant at the time as well, working on a project on Paul. So it made sense to kind of triage my energy, and ended up being an accidental Paul scholar. I still try not to be just a Paul scholar, though. I think this is that silos thing. I've got a commentary on Revelation coming out this year, for example, and I still try to listen to other conversations and not get swallowed by Paul world, which can be a bit of a thing.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Okay, so you said you wanted to write your dissertation on Revelation, and then you discovered, Pauline apocalyptic. And you discovered sort of similarities and differences. So what were some of the sort of the distinctions or the differences you were noticing that were sort of unsettling you, or that were confusing to you?
Good question. I hadn't thought about that in a while. What's some of the things that were most confusing? Because I have so many years in now, it's hard to look back and remember why you're confused. There was one of the big differences was some of the discussion about continuity and discontinuity, some of the discussion about covenant, some of the ways systematic theology was being brought into the conversation in very different ways. Those are some of the little kind of trigger points. Those are still questions I've got, to be honest. There's still some of the flashpoints of the debate, some of the tensions in the debate. Some of it was just language. Some of these things I thought were massive differences turned out to not be as big. I've since kind of come to the view that I think there's a tremendous amount of space for mutual agreement, possibly at least good conversation on shared terms between Revelation scholars, apocalyptic literature scholars, and so on, and Paul people. So there's one of the things I try and do in the book is clear a way where there's this kind of cross purposes talking. Actually, there is some agreement there. Maybe there's some places where there's not. There are genuine disagreements, but there are other places where it's more a question of emphasis or of terminology rather than of actual substantial disagreement. So
sure,
I think I'm still working on this. I'm still trying to see the similarities and the differences. I actually think Paul is closer to the thinking of the Book of Revelation than sometimes is appreciated in all sorts of ways. I'm doing teaching a class at the moment on First and Second Thessalonians, and there's a tremendous amount of shared material, shared convictions, it seems to me. So, there's a lot of different places where I was just confused, but a lot of it comes down to this. These conversations sometimes happen in the same rooms with the same people over many, many years, and there's something about the kind of sociality of the guild that you end up with these shorthands among Paul scholars and shorthands among Revelation scholars, and rarely do the same groups of people hang around in the same rooms, and that's kind of a problem, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so if you were on and this is a fun question, if you were on a desert island kind of scenario, and you could only bring the work of kind of one author working within this stream of Pauline apocalyptic, whose work would you choose and why?
Am I going to get deliveries of their new work if I'm on this island?
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm talking about the rest of their work. That changes it, because when the obvious answer was to say Karl Barth, because it depends how long I'm going to be on the island. If I've got Barth with me, I'm going to be fine for a while.
You're good for a lifetime. Yeah.
Not to say that Barth's always right about everything, but he never fails to make you interested, and that's something that you're going to need on an island. If I'm going to continue to receive deliveries, and if I'm being put on the island right now, I'd probably say Beverly Gaventa, because not only has she got some great stuff that I've thoroughly enjoyed reading, and again, I'm always stimulated by her work. Her Romans commentary is not far away, and I would hate to be on an island when that gets published and not receive the delivery. So
sure,
there's a couple. again, within the apocalyptic world, if that's my kind of the field of things I'm allowed to take, Ernst Käsemann's work is always interesting, and he was engaged in so many interesting different debates and connects. And he has he's a really good essayist. He wrote a lot of really good short form material. And I guess if I'm stuck on an island and the sun is blazing, I'm not going to be able to sit and read for a long time. So reading some of his essays, picking them up and putting them down has been a really good kind of companion for a while. I've still got some to read sitting here as well. So you asked me for one and I gave you three, but there you
go. You're good. Yeah. One thing I'm interested in that I noticed with Käsemann and with J. Lewis Martin is that they both were also technically John scholars, or they at least wrote books on John as well. So I'm wondering like how integrated these are in their writings, because it doesn't seem to me like in Pauline Apocalyptic that has continued, where there's sort of this, I don't know, reciprocal interest, I guess you could say, between John and Paul.
Fair critique. That's a fair critique. I think it's a strange thing. It's kind of, on one level, the Apocalyptic Paul conversation is a really integrative conversation. There are systematic theologians engaged in it, ethicists, scholars of apocalyptic literature. It's quite a diverse community of scholars, which is rare in Paul world, actually, sadly. The Apocalyptic Paul group of people, if there is such a thing, it is quite a diverse bunch, which is lovely. And that's actually not just lovely, but important. But at the same time, it also threatens to become very much a Paul conversation. And I think there are important things that we can learn by those working on apocalyptic in John, in Revelation, Hebrews, other places. So I think there's scope for more of those conversations. I'd like to think that I'm contributing a little bit to that. I try to keep my hand in with the kind of apocalyptic literature and Revelation scholarship. The danger is it can't be down to one person doing it. I mean, what we need is good conversations among specialists in different areas, rather than one person trying to become, the master of all they survey. So I think there's definitely a lot of scope for people to bring these conversations together and to see where we've said similar things and where we've said different things. There are some good people doing good work on John still. There's a good book by Ben Reynolds on John as an apocalyptic gospel at the moment, for example, and other areas of New Testament study. And I'm not even yet talking about the latter prophets and Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholarship, which of course should be part of this conversation too. So there's anyone looking for a PhD project, there's definitely some good comparative work to be done, and we need to see more of this stuff, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can only imagine that if that were your project, I know it is to some extent yours, that I think one of the major obstacles has got to be just the sheer volume of literature. I mean, even just to become like really sort of solidly familiar with Paul, there's just so much you have to read. So then to sort of be kind of a bridge figure between Paul and John, I can only imagine.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I try to keep the books short. I mean, how many short books on Paul are there? It seems it's impossible to write short books on Paul.
Yeah. Oh man.
There's been a lot of very large ones recently. So I wanted to write a short book on Paul, at least to give pointers to the bigger books. And we need more. I think we need some of these short books as well for people to find their way, especially for people who are not specialists. You can't expect someone writing on Hebrews to become fully conversant in all of the weird world of Paul arcana. Right. So sometimes you've got to have the little pointers for non-specialists, and that's one of the things that at least the first half of the book tries to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, what's one critique you would make of Apocalyptic Paul, and also how would you sort of respond to that critique if it was given to you?
Yeah, there were quite a few. I mean, it's definitely generated a lot of pushback. The second half of the book is about the nature of the main critiques, and then some kind of attempts by me to kind of contribute and nuance and add to the conversation. One of the big critiques is that these Paul scholars have failed to attend to the Jewish apocalyptic literature. That's a critique that I kind of address throughout the book. I think that's perhaps not as forceful a critique as it sounds, although a lot of these Paul scholars are not doing extensive exegetical work with these texts, and that is a problem. We all need to do a little bit better with that. There is at least the recognition that that's important in some sense. Again, different scholars understand this differently. But when we're talking about apocalyptic in Paul, most of these scholars are not just using the word entirely differently. They are recognizing it's part of his cultural encyclopedia. Now, obviously, there's always more you can do. One of the critiques that does stick, I think, is scholarship on that literature has really come along a lot in the last 20, 30 years, particularly. And Paul scholars have not kept up. Right, we're all in our silos. It's hard enough to keep up with Paul, and we haven't. One of the things that we've lost in not keeping up is there's been this reliance on outdated analyses of Jewish apocalyptic thought, and that's one of the things that I kind of call out in the book and say that we can do better on this. So that's one of the places. I think another critique from within the guild of Paul scholars, particularly, is that the apocalyptic reading of Paul is kind of Marcionite or supersessionist. The kind of, I mean, people like to lob these grenades at each other all over the place, but and that one I don't think is a particularly fair critique. We can always do better, I think, but I think a lot of the writers that I've studied have a fairly sophisticated account of what they mean by continuity. While emphasizing the discontinuity of the apocalypse of Jesus Christ and the kind of invasive, radical nature of that, that does not amount to a kind of a straightforward sweeping away of Israel's history or a straightforward sweeping away of any sense of continuity in salvation history. It has a very particular account of what that continuity looks like and where it's to be located. I tried to make a contribution towards that a little bit, but there's plenty of other people as well doing this work. So that is there. It just requires a bit more careful reading, I think. And I was completely guilty of this as an early PhD student. I didn't read some of these texts carefully enough and generously enough to see what was really going on. So that's a critique that's out there. It's one that I've voiced myself and I've changed my mind about. I think there's actually quite a sophisticated account of continuity in the apocalyptic Paul that needs to be looked at and could perhaps be said more clearly, but certainly could also be heard more generously as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm speaking to myself there. You know, I made these mistakes. We all kind of listen better, can't we?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay, since you brought this up just now, as far as the relationship between sort of Pauline apocalyptic and then Jewish apocalypticism, because I know that's been kind of you mentioned that that Pauline scholars have not done a great job of sort of keeping up with that with new literature on that, but certainly that's been kind of a fertile territory is exploring the relationship between those two. So what in your mind is sort of the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I mean, the title of my PhD was Paul Among the Apocalypses, and a nice kind of vague term "among" was chosen deliberately, not just for the illusion, and you got to have a clever title, right? So I was trying to kind of suggest I wasn't really trying to make a straightforward derivation argument that Paul kind of derives his thought from the apocalyptic literature, not least because some of those texts post-date Paul anyway, but that he belongs kind of within that world, even though he himself doesn't write in the genre apocalypse. His thinking is a fair distillation, a very particular Christologically shaped and informed, and that's not a small thing, version of apocalyptic thought, but he nevertheless belongs kind of within the world. So I kind of keep it at that vague level of abstraction. I'm not really making a case for Paul deriving his thought from a broader phenomenon of apocalyptic thought. but it's part of how he thinks. It's part of his linguistic and cultural world. He's a first century apocalyptic Jew, and we do well to read other first century apocalyptic Jews when we read Paul. He's part of that world. But then also recognizing that the profound effect that a particular apocalypse of something God had done in Christ has on Paul's construal of that way of thinking. The fact that he's a letter writer is particularly interesting, of course, because you've got this contingent form that he brings if he has coherence, I believe he does, he has a coherent theology, but he brings it to bear on these different contingent situations, and that's what makes him so infuriating and fascinating to study. But I think apocalyptic thought is actually very central to early Christianity across the board. You see it not just in Paul, in Hebrews and Revelation and John, and we've talked about that. Mark, for example, I think is a very apocalyptic account of Jesus' life. So I think this is not just a Paul thing. This is a New Testament thing, and beyond. So that's some of how the connections work. Does that get at what you're asking?
Yeah, definitely it does. Yeah. No, and I'm glad we've talked about also, the role of apocalyptic in John and Hebrews and elsewhere. What would you say? What would you say? I don't know if I would ask you what's the relationship between Johannine apocalyptic and Pauline apocalyptic, but what's sort of distinctive about Johannine apocalyptic? Like how would you say it's different from apocalyptic Paul?
I mean, you'd have to ask a John scholar.
Yeah.
One thing I will say is sometimes our readings of Paul, apocalyptic readings of Paul, have kind of been overly focused on eschatology to the point that the word apocalyptic is practically seen as being synonymous with eschatological. And if you ask scholars of John or particularly of Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature and early Christian apocalyptic literature, from what I understand of those conversations, that almost exclusive focus on eschatology has been seriously questioned, and a broader account of what it means to speak of apocalyptic literature has been offered, not least in a focus on epistemology, on the nature of revealed wisdom, and accounts of the cosmos beyond just accounts of the end times. And I think that's actually quite congenial to the apocalyptic Paul in ways that I've been trying to develop and need to be developed further. That it's actually this central revelatory focus that needs to be taken on board. Unfortunately, a lot of the apocalyptic Paul major texts, the major commentators on Paul and the major Pauline scholars have often worked with kind of these outdated analyses of Jewish apocalyptic as being purely an eschatological or centrally, or the sine qua non of apocalyptic is eschatology, and that's not necessarily the case. And I actually think that's quite helpful in all sorts of ways. So that's one of the things I've tried to develop. I'm still trying to work on, particularly with an emphasis on that epistemological point that we're talking about, revelation. I mean, for a lot of Paul scholars who are keen on Barth, that should be a pretty useful insight. And there's been some good recent work in Jewish apocalyptic, including in John, that have talked a lot about this kind of epistemological point. And I think there's more in Paul to uncover there. I think, no pun intended.
Yeah, and one thing I picked up on as I was kind of researching for this apocalyptic Paul Booth was the affinity for Barth among sort of this group of scholars. So why would you say that Pauline apocalyptic folks tend to really like Karl Barth? Like what's sort of the relationship going on there in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case. There's a big big Barth influence, although a lot of that is mediated through Ernst Käsemann, actually. And if you look at the genealogy of the movement, in as much as that helps explain it, traces a lot of this stuff back to Käsemann's work. But I mean, it makes sense. He's got such a huge focus on revelation, right? That it makes sense that an apocalyptic reading of Paul, which is about, as I've just said, it's about revelation, would find a happy partner in Barth's reading of texts. Barth's Romans commentary continues to be incredibly important, but increasingly, actually, the later work of Barth is being more carefully read, and this is one of the good things about doing this work in dialogue with systematic theologians. Is a lot of Barth scholars have been pushing back a little on some of the receptions of early Barth in the Apocalyptic Paul conversation. So that's a little part of the book that kind of I dip my toe into that systematics world a little bit and try and hear some of those challenges. But yeah, the focus on revelation, the focus on the found nature of the eruptive work of God in Christ, which is so characteristic of Barth's theology, is definitely kind of one of the driving engines of the apocalyptic reading of Paul. I think it's interesting because it's not just about Barth. Sometimes people think of this as just straightforwardly a Barthian reading of Paul. I think there are other apocalyptic readers of Paul who don't necessarily kind of come straight from Barth world. And increasingly so. I think it's becoming an increasingly diverse conversation, which is really good to see. It's not straightforwardly a particular Protestant Barth or a Protestant Paul or a particular Barthian Paul. I think there's a bit more going on. It's a bit more interesting and complex than that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. On a related note, since you're bringing up sort of the Protestant factor, because it does seem like Paul. Yeah, from what I've read, it seems like Pauline apocalyptic has been pretty dominated by Protestant biblical scholars and theologians, and sometimes, like as you said in your book, sort of staunchly Protestant scholars. So what would you say it is in the apocalyptic Paul that sort of makes Protestant scholars given to it and not other Christian scholars?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a fair assessment, and it's shifting, but I think that's probably a fair assessment of how it's been so far. Again, some of that is just genealogical, but again, these particular theologies of the word, these particular theologies of crisis, these are congenial to the emphases of Paul's thought understood apocalyptically. So I can see why that would be the case. Particular accounts of nature and grace would lend themselves to this kind of militant reading of Paul. But it's by no means only a Protestant Paul, and this is what makes me kind of resist people who might say it's just straightforwardly a Protestant reading of Paul. There are apocalyptic readers of Paul in various places. Cyril O'Regan, for example, is a Catholic interpreter of Paul who's written on apocalyptic in theology, the possibilities of a Catholic apocalyptic theology, which is he argues is not a contradiction in terms. Recently, David Bentley Hart from Eastern Orthodoxy has written a book fairly recently called Tradition and Apocalypse, pushing forward a particular apocalyptic reading of continuity in history. So there are conversations happening elsewhere as well. Paul world notoriously is often dominated by particular Protestant voices, but it need not be so. There's also really good stuff coming from global Pentecostalism as well, which needs to be heard. Lisa Bowen's recent book on African American reception of Paul adds another important set of voices to the conversation, which is quite congenial to some of the things that apocalyptic Paul scholars have been saying. So I think there are some pieces in place and some signs that it could and should be a much broader conversation than just a kind of a narrow Protestant male conversation.
Sure.
Sometimes a problem in Paul world, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what have you yourself kind of tried to contribute to this discussion? Like how have you tried to advance the conversation?
I mean, some of this will be autobiographical. I went through that kind of post PhD doldrums of like, why did I do all this and what was it all for?
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
privileged that I did get a job, so I wasn't necessarily having the kind of career angst that many friends I have are going through. But I still kind of thought what I asked myself questions about the nature of the guild and the nature of how we do theological conversation, and a bit saddened to see. I think one of the things, the phrase I use in the book is people enjoying theological prize fighting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we go along to our conferences and watch the big men whack chunks out of each other and sit and eat popcorn. And I'm like, that can't be how we should do this. So one of the things I tried to write this book in a sense as a kind of an exorcism of those demons in myself, I guess, to try and offer an account of, or rather to try to myself to do generous listening and to host a conversation between different parties. Sometimes people who really do disagree with each other in profound ways, and that's fine. But to try and model a different tone for particularly how Pauline scholarship can be done. So that was part of it. To try and host a space with different Paul readers and systematic theologians and Second Temple Jewish scholars, well aware that this can't really be one person's job, and there's real limitations in I've only got so much time, right? I can't become conversant. So that was one thing. I've contributed one thing. I hope I've contributed a kind of an example of the kind of conversations that we need, even if mine don't ultimately convince anybody. At least we might do it in this way. That would be great. I do hope, though, in chapter 5 at the end of the book, where I try and give some exegetical work of my own, I hope I've taken us a little further, perhaps, in how we talk about some of these big debates in the Apocalyptic Paul, such as the question of continuity and discontinuity, the question of revelation and epistemology, how we understand that in relation to human wisdom and so on. Some of the ways that salvation has been understood, the relationships between forensic accounts and so-called cosmological accounts. So there's these places where I try to be a little bit more integrative and hopefully a bit more develop some of the nuances that are there. That's for other people to assess whether I've been at all successful in any of that. But that's what I hoped to have done. I mean, even if people only read the first 2 chapters and it gives them a good survey of this discussion, which I think is a fascinating discussion, then I'll be quite happy. But hopefully some people will read to the end and see that I'm not simply a pundit and might have actually said a few things myself. You never know.
Sure. No, yeah, I have read most of it so far. I don't think I've finished. I don't think I've gotten quite to the final chapter, but I will say the survey for me, the first couple chapters were super helpful. I mean, like you said, there's nowhere else really you can go for a kind of a quick, bird's eye view of a field that's just so massive in its literature. So I found it super, super helpful. And I hope others will as well. Yeah. You mentioned epistemology a few times so far, I noticed. And I don't think I've talked with Susan Eastman or Doug Hare. I don't think that's come up with either of them, the role of epistemology, but I know that figures prominently in this conversation of Pauline apocalyptic. So what's sort of the role of epistemology there?
What's the role of epistemology is a big question, right?
Yeah.
I think it's incredibly central for Paul's theology that he understands that the revelation of Jesus Christ hasn't just added new information to the world, but has actually transformed how we know. There's actually a reshaped epistemology. This is both in keeping with the Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature, which is, after all, about revealed things, But for Paul, I think Jesus isn't just another revealed thing. He's not just one more revealed thing in the world, as a part of a genus of things that are revealed. I think for Paul, the revelation of Jesus, the apocalypse of Jesus, is J. Lewis Martin called it an epistemological earthquake. That is, the classic kind of language, but it's changed not just what we know, but how we know. And so I think that's one of the things that's really driving Paul's thought, right in the architecture of how he thinks, that we see differently. We no longer, as he says, we no longer see according to the flesh as we once saw. J. Lewis Martin wrote a very influential article on that text, and I think it's still, I go back to it from time to time and read it again, and I think it's very insightful in seeing the stakes for Paul. It's not just that he's learned something new, it's just that he thinks differently because of the resurrection of Jesus, because of the cross, as Martin takes it. So that's something I think that's not been sufficiently developed, although one or two scholars have made that a real focus. Alexandra Brown, for example, her work on 1 Corinthians, the cross and human continuity. I think I've forgotten the title of the book. The cross and human transformation, the opposite of continuity. Okay. Incredibly useful book that really places a lot of emphasis on epistemology in Paul's apocalyptic thought and how that relates to human transformation, which is, again, this is another example of how sometimes our focus on eschatology has bracketed out some of these arguably more important issues in Paul's apocalyptic thought. So, I think there's lots to be done there. It's really interesting, though, that there's a similar conversation that has been happening over in Second Temple Jewish literature world, where there's increasingly more of a recognition that epistemology is important in those texts. There's some good work happening there as well. So lots of things to be done, lots more listening to be done.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So what are some like new directions in Pauline apocalyptic that you see kind of happening on the scene today? And are there any that seem especially kind of promising or interesting for sort of the direction of the conversation in the future?
Wow. I mean, that's a question for a senior scholar, not for somebody like me. I don't know, because how am I supposed to know what's going to be significant? One of the things that I've mentioned already that I think is really important is the diversity of voices that are coming into this conversation. Emerging scholars from various quarters. I've mentioned Lisa Bowens already, whose work I deeply appreciated. Robert Moses is another who brings in voices from African theology to talk about Paul's cosmology and principalities and powers and this kind of thing. So there's some good conversations that are still to be had there with those people. One of the things that's really interesting is how creative it is as a conversation. You mentioned Susan Eastman a couple of times. Her recent, well, it's not that recent anymore, but her book Paul and the Person is an apocalyptic account of Paul's anthropology, but she does it in such an interesting way by bringing in these unexpected interlocutors from kind of neuroscience and ancient philosophy. Yeah. So this is the kind of integrative work that I see happening. Serious conversations with systematic theologians. I wrote this book mostly during the lockdowns, during the quarantine periods, during the COVID pandemic, and ended up in a Zoom call talking about apocalyptic theology on a kind of monthly basis that Phil Ziegler in Aberdeen set up and invited me to. And it was a gathering of New Testament people, Paul people, systematics people, all trying to listen to each other and across the disciplinary divides. And for me, that is going to open up all sorts of interesting areas, because there's a lot of work to be done there. As yet, specialists in first century Judaism are not sufficiently part of that conversation for reasons that we've chatted about. So I think that's one of the things I'd like to see more of. But yeah, I think it's just the diversity of this particular group of people is one of the things that gives me great hope that this is not your normal kind of cloistered Pauline conversation. I don't think so anyway. Maybe I'm just part of the cloister, and so I don't see. But so yeah, which of those things become important? I couldn't tell you. It's not for me to say.
Sure.
But I do have a lot of hope that there's good things happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, kind of on a personal level, how would you say Pauline Apocalyptic has sort of affected you or influenced you? You said you're a Christian, you teach in a Christian university, so sort of apply, like, how has it sort of manifested itself in your actual life outside of your scholarship?
You're assuming I have a life outside of scholarship. Sometimes I feel like I haven't. How has it affected me? It's forced me to become more conversant with my own tradition, with Christian theology, broadly understood. It's forced me to, as a good thing, it's forced me to have lots of good interactions with colleagues who are theologians, and to try and learn from them. So it's made me a real student of that stuff again. I'm still very much a novice in that area, but I'm trying to learn better. So that, I think, has been good. It's been good personally as well. It's good to become a novice again at something. It's I've enjoyed that. So that's one of the ways it's affected me personally. I teach ministerial students for a living, and they will often ask you the question, what difference does this mean for the real world? And I'm trying to think about this at the minute. I'm writing a little bit on this. One of the things that the apocalyptic conversation about Paul does is forces me to ask the question, well, what do I really mean by the real world? What is the real world? If Paul's apocalyptic view of things is so radically transformative, then it makes me ask questions about really profound questions about the real world, and I have to try and translate those for ministerial students who are wondering what on earth I'm doing with my time. So yeah, I'm kind of wrestling with that stuff a lot at the moment. I'm trying to think a bit more about those questions. That sounds kind of really highfalutin and kind of profound, but really it's trying to press the question as to if what Paul says about new creation is to be taken seriously, then that's going to affect everything, and that's going to affect, just as it did for Paul, it's going to affect the contingent situations in which I find myself, as I have to respond to ethical challenges that I face, in the light of the new creation, and reason accordingly. As I think Paul thinks, he doesn't just think according to a world that remains undisturbed. He has to address these real life situations in his churches, working from a new basis of the new creation revealed in Christ. So everything then is on the table at that point.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'll wrap up with one final question, and then we can finish. Which is just where can folks find more about you and your work?
Oh, you're assuming people want to. Where can they find out more about me and my work? I mean, they can read the book. That would be a good start.
Yeah.
I'm always keen to make connections with people. One of the things that I'm kind of an external processor, so I enjoy kind of thinking out loud with others. They can certainly look at the things that I've published. I'll be bouncing around a bit this year, actually. I'm going to be in Toronto in a couple of weeks for a symposium there at Wycliffe College on Apocalyptic and Paul, actually. I'm a pretty regular attender of SBL AAR, so I'll be there in San Antonio this year. Always happy to buy someone a coffee and listen to what they've got to say. For those in the UK, I'm a regular attender at the British New Testament Society and a seminar chair there. So I'm usually bouncing around at VNTS. So that's probably a good place to bump into me. Always happy to chat. Awesome. Beyond that, my next thing coming out is I've got a short kind of slightly more popular level commentary on Revelation coming out in hopefully by the end of this year. So that'll be the next
Okay.
thing. And
Okay.
who knows? Maybe some more stuff on Apocalyptic and Paul, or maybe I'll do something different. I haven't decided yet.
Sure. Which press is the Revelation commentary with?
That's coming out with Smyth and Helwys in their second run of the Reading the New Testament series.
Okay, got it. Okay, yeah, we'll keep an eye out for that. Well, thank you, Jamie. This has been a joy chatting with you. So I hope that the tea didn't wake you up too much more. You already had a lot of caffeine for the day.
I've got too much caffeine in me today, but thanks so much. It's been great to chat.